Duval is 62 years old, and he spent roughly half of his life in prison, specifically the last 30 years. Not for a crime he didn't commit or on trumped-up charges. As you're going to see, Duvall is a sexual predator, a violent one. He's a serial rapist with a long list of convictions in the 70s and 80s. His victims, teenage girls. On his last conviction, Duvall was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but he's been in custody ever since 1987 because authorities didn't believe he was well enough to be set free. But that changed this week. The Minnesota Sex Offender Program overseeing him approved Duvall's petition for a release, saying his progress in treatment outweighs his, quote, fearful diagnosis as a sexual sadist. But there are a lot of officials in Minnesota who don't agree. The head of the Human Services Commission that oversees the sex offender program says it plans to appeal. In fact, that head, Emily Pierre, gave us this statement saying, I, along with 3 testifying experts in this case, believe that Thomas Duvall poses an exceptional risk to public safety and should not be released into the community at this time. I disagree with the court's decision to the contrary and will appeal this decision. Chris Sears is a reporter with the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. He joins me live now. Chris, I don't understand the disconnect. If you've got a guy who's being assessed by experts, and several of the experts are weighing in saying, he's not ready, he's dangerous, how do they get trumped, and how does he end up getting the green light to be released?
Well, I think it's important to remember that, Thomas Duvall is one of the most violent sex offenders in Minnesota state history. Now, keep in mind that this is someone who has already admitted to attacking more than 60 women. This is someone who in 1978, he was convicted for raping a 17-year-old girl while driving her home from the state fair. And then just 3 days after getting out of prison for that horrific assault, he went out and he sexually assaulted 2 more girls, ages 14 and 15. And then after he got out of prison for those assaults, on the day after Christmas in 1987, he broke into a woman's apartment, he bound her with an electrical cord, and he repeatedly raped her over a 3-hour period, and he left her for dead. That's Thomas Duvall. That is the person that this treatment program in the state of Minnesota says is fit and ready to be released into the community.
And I should just add one detail to your extraordinary reporting there of that many, numerous assaults. 1978, 1981, a string of 4 more in 1981 and 1987. That 1987 woman that you referenced, who was bound with the electrical cord and repeatedly raped over a 2-hour period and hit with a hammer, she was 17. So everybody in that list was between the ages of 14 and 17. And upon release, as you said several times, within 3 days on one release, he was already reoffending. Within 12 days of another release, he was already reoffending. I come back to the same question, though, Chris. There have been experts who have weighed in and have said, this isn't right, he's not ready. In fact, one of those experts, I believe, is his primary therapist, named Christy Mike. And I'm just going to read a quick piece from her report, but she said, Duvall continues to have deviant sexual thoughts. While a thought in and of itself is not deviant unless acted upon, having deviant thoughts about minors who fall within the petitioner's victim pool is problematic. And I guess, Chris, as it turns out, he was asked to write journals about his fantasies while he was in prison as part of his therapy. And though he was not directed to, he went right to the victims that he victimized and fantasized about them. And I'm not sure if that's what Christy Mike is referring to, about minors who fall within the petitioner's victim pool being problematic. But this is his primary therapist. Where is the disconnect? Who is saying he's fine? And how are they any better than his primary therapist?
Well, in fact, one of the court's own appointed psychologists reviewed hundreds, if not thousands of pages of his treatment history and concluded that Thomas Duvall is not ready to be released into the community because he continues to have violent sexual fantasies and because he continues to fail to pass lie detector tests about those violent fantasies. Now, one of the things people need to keep in mind is that Thomas Duvall has been locked up since 1991, not in a prison, but in a treatment program. Minnesota is one of 20 states that operates a separate, essentially extra-legal confinement system for sex offenders. So after they complete their prison terms, they are sent to so-called treatment. And these centers can keep these men indefinitely. And so in 2011, a number of these sex offenders sued the state of Minnesota, basically claiming that the state was violating their due process constitutional rights by keeping them locked up indefinitely without access to the courts. Essentially, we were operating these little Guantanamos in the middle of Minnesota. And so as a result of that lawsuit, a federal judge declared that our program is unconstitutional and that you actually have to give them access to the courts, and that this program has to show that it's not just punishing the sex offenders, but it's actually treating them. That if you operate a treatment program, you actually have to show that you're treating them. So the program itself has been under pressure from the federal courts to actually release more of these offenders into the community. So here we sit today, and Thomas Duvall is one of these people. He's been locked up, in essence, for 30 years.
I mean, I understand the constitutional argument. That makes perfect sense. I guess what I don't understand is how somebody who took a hammer to a 17-year-old's head while he bound her with an electrical cord and molested her and raped her repeatedly for hours upon end wasn't sentenced to life. That's what I'm so curious about, is how he wasn't sentenced to life. Let me bring in Derek Logue. He's a registered sex offender, and he's the author of and the founder of OnceFallen.com. I also want to bring in Ashleigh Wilcott, a certified child welfare law specialist, a juvenile court judge, and trial attorney. And I also want to bring in a sex therapist, Chris Donahue. Derek, let me go to you first. I think I know what you're going to say, but I want you to have your say. This man was sentenced to 20 years. He's been held for 30. He has a constitutional privilege, yet he's scary and he's dangerous according to the experts who are treating him. Do you believe that perhaps this is one of those cases where he should have been locked up for life?
Well, my take on this situation is that, first of all, I feel like he's an anomaly among people on the registry. The vast majority of us don't reoffend. I've been out for 15 years, so I would like to say that's proof of that. The thing about it is, I'm not here to speculate. I'm here to say one thing. If this person's released, what I hope is that this person, stays on the straight and narrow, and that he gets a job, becomes a productive member of society, and that he doesn't bother anybody and lives out the rest of his days, because there's a lot riding on it, both for him and for all of us who are stuck on this registry, because we're all going to be treated the same way this guy is in the eyes of society.
I totally hear you, and look, the Constitution is here for a reason, and we all deserve the protection of it. I guess when I look at a guy like Thomas Duvall and the reoffending he's already done and the extraordinary sadistic nature of his sexual crimes to teenage girls, I wonder if we should all be put at risk so that he can get a privilege when he's already sort of defied his right to be extended the same privilege the rest of us get. I guess if you had a sister, would you be okay giving him that chance and have her living next to him? Derek, can you hear me?
I didn't know.
I'm sorry, Derek. Yeah, I just want, I get what you're saying, and he should have a right, and you hope he walks the straight and narrow. But do you want to risk your sister's safety living next to him so that he can have that right, and we can all cross our fingers that he's going to be okay?
I can't deal in hypotheticals, but the problem that we've had with civil commitment programs is that it really has been a way for the courts, for people to go beyond the Constitution and keep people detained long beyond their prison sentences. I've been speaking with a guy for over 7 years named Chris Crick, who's in one of these programs now, right there in Moose Lake. And he tells me they're not even giving him treatment, and he's been in there for 7, 8, 9 years now. And
so I think
they're just going through the motions.
Question. It's an important question, because I think anyone who knows that a dangerous guy who's reoffended, is going to be back out on the street, doesn't want to be on the street with him, which is not really a hypothetical. It's really an honest question. Would you like one of your best girlfriends, your mother, your sister, your niece, to be on the same street? And would you be crossing your fingers and hope for the best and be okay with that, Derek?
Well, the thing about it is, I don't have any living family at this moment to deal with this hypothetical situation. But, to humor for a minute, what if a murderer moved down the street from me, or somebody who smashed a little old lady upside the street? The thing is, I'm not going to be told that this person killed 20 people or, robbed 30 old ladies. We only do this with people who are convicted of sex crimes, and I think that's problematic.
So let me bring in Chris Donahue on this one, as a sex therapist and clinical psychologist who treats people with sexual proclivities that are illegal and dangerous.
Right.
How do you respond to Derek saying, well, murderers get released and dangerous criminals get released, and how should the sex offenders be any different, even though they're treated differently?
This is completely different, because we're talking about someone who not only has a consistent history of sexual assault, it's also someone who has a primary sexual arousal to teenagers. That part will not go away. And so if someone has that kind of arousal and they're in treatment, and after this length of time they're still saying and showing through their logs that they're having deviant sexual thoughts, this is not someone who's done enough work on their sexuality in order for me to feel comfortable that they will be out in the world dealing with all the triggers and the high-risk situations appropriately.
Yeah, Chris, real quickly, do you get the notion that the primary therapist can say what she has said about Tom Duvall, and yet I think he's the clinical director of the program that he's in, says that he doesn't know that there's deviant, violent arousal with this particular patient. Like, they seem to have divergent opinions.
Yeah, and it's a watering down. When someone says it's not illegal or a crime to have a fantasy that's problematic, that's true. But again, when we're talking about someone that has a history of impulse control, lacks empathy, and doesn't have boundaries, it then does become problematic. And again, these treatment centers, they sometimes operate on a really problematic continuum where they're used to hearing people that maybe are far worse. And so they're more comfortable hearing certain things and taking that risk.
This one seems to be on the far worst part of the spectrum to me. Let me bring in Ashleigh Wilcott on this. You're the welfare law specialist. You're the judge and the trial attorney. You're the person who's going to get me off the legal ledge, because I don't understand two things. Why didn't he get a life sentence to protect us all for life, so we don't have to have this constitutional conundrum? And then how is it he could be released when his primary therapist says it's problematic, and others are weighing in saying it's problematic, and the Attorney General has already in 2014 blocked his release because he's dangerous? How does it happen?
Here's where the disconnect is, in my opinion. I don't think the panel got it right. So I think that they looked at what the therapist said and thought, okay, he has successfully completed the sex offender treatment. Fine, that may be the case, but that does not mean that he should be released. It does not mean that he will not reoffend. It does not mean that he does not pose a huge risk to society. The man is a beast based on his actions, his diagnosis of a sexual sadist. So they got it wrong. And I think the disconnect between, say, the therapist and the actual agency that wants to appeal is, okay, one of them can say, yes, he's completed our sex offender treatment successfully in our opinion. Well, that's well and good. But you still have to consider the risk to the people in the world and the chance he'll reoffend. He's going to reoffend.
I believe that, and I have to just give big props to everyone on my panel for your perspectives tonight. Chris Sears, thank you for your reporting. Chris Donahue, thank you for your expertise. Derek Logue, we've butted heads a lot on this program, and I appreciate you being thoughtful about this segment, and I do welcome you back at another time. And Ashleigh Wilcott, thank you as well. I'm really looking forward to seeing how this story turns out. I'd like to have you all back as well. Thank you.